Welcome to episode 19 of Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobbie Holmes. This week's story is super duper creepy and perfect for October. I'm getting so many emails from my listeners, I started a board with a list of suggestions. So much good material. This one jumped to the top of the list because I actually received multiple requests for it. Shout out to listeners Katrina and Lindsay. This week, I'm going to cover Ed Gein. But before I start the story, I just wanted to tell you about this cool thing I started. It's a way to help support my podcast so that I'm able to keep bringing you killer stories. The site is called Buy Me a Coffee. But you can choose whatever you like. I feel like a beer sounds more congratulatory, like, good job, let me buy you a beer. So you can go to the site and give me a one-time donation. One beer is just $5. Or if you want to get me really drunk, you can buy me 5 beers. Don't worry, guys. The money doesn't actually go to beer. It's just a way of showing your support. Making a podcast takes a lot of time and effort. It sometimes is difficult to get it done every week on top of a full-time job and momming a 4-year-old. The donations will help offset the cost of my hosting site and help with equipment upgrades. So if you enjoy killer stories, buy me a beer. Go to buymeacoffee.com/killerstories. I greatly appreciate it. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's get to the good stuff. If you are unfamiliar with Ed Gein, you are about to get your mind blown. The things he did are like a fictional horror movie. In fact, multiple characters from horror films have been based off him. Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, Norman Bates from Psycho, and Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But before I jump right into the creepy weird stuff, you know I gotta fill you in on some background on Ed. Ed Gein was born August 27, 1906 in Wisconsin. He had an older brother named Henry. His mother didn't really bond with Henry and had hoped and prayed for a baby girl. When she discovered she had yet another boy, she decided to make the most of it, and Ed became a child that she could mold into the perfect man. Not an abusive alcoholic like his father. He tended to hit Augusta and the boys if things didn't go his way. When Ed was a young boy, his parents, George and Augusta, purchased a farm on 155 acres in Plainfield, Wisconsin. Ed and his brother spent most of their time at home doing chores on the farm. They lived in isolation. Neither boy had any friends. In fact, the only time they left their farm was to go to school. Ed had a droopy eye and a crooked smile. He was shy and kept to himself. The bullies at school targeted him because of his timid behavior and droopy eye. His mother actually punished the boys if they tried to make friends, which just sounds so crude. How can you deny your child friendship? Well, Augusta was uber religious. She believed the world was evil and pretty much all other people were bad influences. She taught the boys her Lutheran beliefs at home, reading from the Bible every afternoon. She also felt that all women, with the exception of herself, of course, were sent here by the devil. Apparently, their only role in life was to pull men to the dark side using promiscuity. Augusta sounds like a peach. She strongly opposed drinking alcohol, which is funny because her husband George was a raging alcoholic. She pretty much hated him. His heavy drinking is what did him in. It led to his death from heart failure at age 66. Neither Augusta nor the boys were too upset by George's death. Like I said, Augusta hated him. The boys were much closer with their mother than their father. Especially Ed. He adored Augusta. She could do no wrong in his eyes. If Henry ever had anything negative to say about Augusta, Ed took great offense. It hurt him to hear anyone talk badly about his mother. Henry and Ed began doing odd jobs around the community. Henry was getting really good at grafting, where Ed did a lot of babysitting. At this time, both brothers lived at home with Augusta. Henry was going to move out, but he was a little concerned with the closeness of Ed and his mother. It seemed unhealthy. May 16th, 1944, the brothers were burning off some marshland vegetation near the farm, and the wind picked it up. It spread the fire, and it was quickly out of control. The fire department finally got it put out that evening. This is when Ed reported Henry missing. There was a group of people who came together to search with lanterns in the dark. The weird part is, Ed said Henry was missing, but he pretty much led the search party right to his body. He wasn't burned, so it was assumed that he died of a heart attack. Later, his death report said he died of asphyxiation from inhaling the fire smoke, but no actual autopsy was performed. So I'm not sure how you come to that conclusion without an autopsy. But who knows? This was 1944. No investigating was done here. Clear-cut case in the eyes of law enforcement. We now know that there was bruising noted on Henry's head, but the police rolled out foul play and everyone else just followed that lead. I think it's more than likely that Henry was the first victim of Ed Gein, but that has never been proven. Now it's just Augusta and Ed living on the farm, which I'm sure is how Ed wanted it. He had her all to himself. But not long after Henry died, Augusta had a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. Ed did everything in his power to care for his mother. He waited on her hand and foot. But there wasn't a lot he could do when Augusta had a second stroke. She went downhill fast and passed away December 29th, 1945. The loss of his mother was extremely hard on Ed. At her funeral, he sobbed loudly. He was unsure how he would be able to go on without her. To quote Harold Schrechter, author of Deviant, The Shocking Story of Ed Gein, the original Psycho, he had, quote, lost his only friend and one true love, and he was absolutely alone in the world, end quote. To preserve the memory of Augusta, Ed boarded up any rooms that were used by her, the downstairs parlor, the entire second floor, and the living room. Once boarded up, he never entered any of those areas in the farmhouse again. This didn't leave him with much space to live in. All that remained was the kitchen and one small room on the first floor. Even with cramped living space, there was no excuse for the filth that he lived in. Garbage piled up everywhere. Dirty dishes towered in the sink. Greasy pots and pans sat on the stove. Granted, Ed was still a shy guy who kept to himself. No one came over anyways. A single guy with no friends or family left, he probably didn't care. But he did get one visitor over the years that triggered a rumor. A 16-year-old boy whose parents knew Ed Gein said he had looked inside of his home. The boy told his friends that Ed had shrunken heads hung all around the house. When he questioned Ed about them, Ed said they were from the Philippines, where a cousin of his served in World War II. Everyone knew that Ed Gein was a little strange, so when the stories of the shrunken heads swirled around, no one thought much about it. Ed frequented a tavern in Pine Grove. One evening in December of 1954, Ed walked into the tavern around closing time. He saw that all the patrons had left. The only person inside was 51-year-old Mary Hogan. She told Ed that she was about to close. He ignored her and walked around the bar, pointed a pistol at her head, and fired. This was a planned execution. Ed had a sled outside waiting for the getaway. Not very fast or discreet, but he pulled Mary Hogan behind him in a sled all the way back to his farm, which took him a few hours. Police found a shell casing and a pile of blood at the tavern, but since Mary was nowhere to be found, this was treated as a missing person case, not a homicide. No other evidence was ever found and the case went cold. In the years following Mary's murder, when the subject came up in town, Ed would say, "She's not missing, she's down on the farm." Everyone assumed Ed was just joking. Perhaps someone should have followed up on his claim. Fast forward a few years, November 15th, 1957. Ed was at the local hardware store. Frank Warden and his mother Bernice were both working. Ed overheard their conversation about how Frank was going hunting in the morning. Ed wasn't known for talking much in public, but he spoke up and told Bernice that he would be back in the morning to buy some antifreeze. The next day, 58-year-old Bernice disappeared. No one took notice until 5 p.m. when Frank returned from hunting and went down to the hardware store. He found blood on the floor and the cash register was hanging open. There was one more piece of evidence: a sales slip for antifreeze. Frank remembered what Gein had said the day before about returning to buy antifreeze and called the police with his suspicions. The police wanted to bring Ed in for questioning, but when they called the farmhouse, he wasn't home. After making a few phone calls, police tracked him down at the Hills residence. He was there doing some work on their family car and had stayed for dinner. When the police arrived, Ed was in the car about ready to leave. It didn't take much questioning before they slapped the cuffs on Ed and arrested him. Now that they had him in custody, police went to his farmhouse in hopes of finding Bernice Warden. What they were about to discover would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They opened the door to Ed's house of horrors to a putrid stench. The officers walked through the house with flashlights. There was garbage all over the floor. They were watching their step when one of the officers noticed something bumped his shoulder. He swung his flashlight around. There, hanging upside down, her body cut down the middle and flapped open and decapitated, was the body of Bernice Warden. The two officers felt ill and stepped outside for a moment. They called for backup. Bernice's head was found next to the body inside of a burlap sack. He had removed her internal organs, and her heart sat next to his stove inside of a plastic bag. They were just scratching the surface of horrific findings in Ed Gein's home. At first glance, they noticed skulls around the house. They had the top portion removed and were used for bowls or candles. Everyone knew the rumors of Ed's shrunken heads, and they assumed these were just replica collectibles, but at closer inspection, these were real human skulls. His four-post bed was decorated with human skulls, and there were several sets of dentures that were out on display. The officers then noticed Ed's furniture. There were 4 chairs that were reupholstered in a very, we will say, unique way. The seats were covered with pieces of human flesh stitched together, including faces that were completely peeled off of the skulls. There were lampshades decorated in the same way, covered in a mosaic of human skin. There were 2 pairs of women's high-heeled shoes and a purse that Ed had given the human flesh treatment as well. There was a curtain pole where at the end he had fastened a pair of women's lips. They found a belt made out of female nipples, literally just a row of nipples sewn together. There was a shoebox that was full of female genitalia, Another one housed severed noses, and another one was full of fingernails. His refrigerator contained bags of human organs. Now we start getting into the really freaky stuff. Yes, believe it or not, it gets freakier. Ed was making a bodysuit of female flesh. He had gloves made from the skin of a large woman's hands. A pair of leggings stitched together with scraps of skin. And most disturbingly, a woman's entire upper body had been peeled off in one piece. A corset was made with her torso, breasts, and face attached. This was not the only human face mask Ed had made. The officers searching his home found at least 9 other skinned faces that had the hair still attached, one of which was Mary Hogan. Ed would actually wear this skin suit. He missed his mother so much that over the past 5 years, he had been working on creating this very suit to feel connected to her again, as if he, quote, literally crawled into her skin. I'm just picturing him walking around his house wearing this skin suit in skin high heels and a nipple belt and carrying a skin purse. So incredibly creepy. Can't picture it? No worries. I have lots of photos to share with you. In this era, police must have been way more lax about keeping a crime scene undisturbed. The media went nuts and took many photographs of the skin-covered items. Police noticed that parts of the house were boarded up. They were half afraid of what they were going to find. But to their surprise, the boarded-up section was very clean. Other than a layer of dust, it looked just like it did the day Augusta died. Think about this. The only murders he committed were that of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. Where did all the other bodies come from? When questioned by police, he admitted what he had done. I wouldn't say willingly admitted. At first, Ed wasn't talking. The Washoe County Sheriff grew tired of Ed's lack of cooperation during questioning. He actually bashed Ed's head over and over off of a brick wall. There are intimidation tactics, and then there is assault. This assault meant that this particular interview could not be used in court. Ed did finally come forward, stating that from 1947 to 1952, he was visiting the cemetery at night. When a new body of a middle-aged woman was buried, he would dig it up and take her home, lowering an empty casket back down into the ground. He would drive the bodies back to his house and skin them like an animal. He told investigators that he attempted this almost 40 times. He felt like he was in some sort of trance and most times would snap out of it and realize what he was doing was wrong and just go back home. But on at least 9 occasions, he came home with a freshly buried, middle-aged woman who resembled his mother. I personally think he only killed Mary and Bernice because he needed a mommy fix and there hadn't been any recent deaths. Ed said he never had sex with any of the bodies or eaten any of the body parts. He only wanted their skin. At first, his story seemed unbelievable to the police. It seemed far-fetched to think that he robbed those graves all by himself. But he took them to the graves he claimed to have gotten the bodies from. When they were exhumed again, most of the coffins were empty. Some had stray body parts left behind, and others he had returned their jewelry, just as he had described. Ed Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was considered mentally incompetent and unfit for trial. He went to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. But in November of 1968, Ed had to face up to his wrongdoing. He was determined mentally able to participate in a trial. For whatever reason, his trial didn't have a jury. Judge Robert Golmar found him guilty of the murder of Bernice Worden. But there was a separate trial to determine where he would serve his sentence, in a prison or a mental facility. He was sent back to live the rest of his life at the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. He was never charged with the murder of Mary Hogan, even though he admitted to it. Oh yeah, and the fact that her face was found inside of his home? What about justice for Mary? Ed died at the age of 77 from lung cancer. He was buried in the Plainfield Cemetery with his brother and his parents. True crime fans visit his grave and would take a chunk of his headstone as a souvenir. It dwindled in size over the years until someone in 2000 got greedy and stole the whole thing. Fun fact, Ed's 1949 Ford that he used to transport the bodies from the cemetery to his house was auctioned off for $760. It was purchased by a man who ran a carnival sideshow and charged 25 cents to see inside. I had mentioned at the beginning of today's episode about the fictional horror movie characters that were based on Ed Gein. The first one was Robert Bloch's novel Psycho, followed by Alfred Hitchcock's cinema rendition in 1960. The character is, of course, Norman Bates. If you've never seen Psycho, first of all, what's wrong with you? Go watch it immediately, and maybe skip the next minute of this podcast so I don't spoil it for you. Norman's mother, Norma, taught him as a young boy that all women, except for her, were whores. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? After the death of Norman's father, he lived alone with Norma. They lived in bliss, just him and his mommy. These two had a very unhealthy relationship, much like Ed and Augusta. Norma had met a new man and planned to marry him. Norman killed them both in a rage of jealousy. He had a lot of guilt about killing his mother and hid her body in the fruit cellar. He developed a personality disorder that when he was in the house, he became Mother, walking, talking, and acting like Norma. Now, Ed didn't kill Augusta, but he did kill other people and wear their skin so he could feel like her. So, close enough. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out in 1974. Leatherface is the mass murderer the horror series is centered around. He has a deformed face and wore a mask made out of the skin of his victims. Hence the name Leatherface. Pretty self-explanatory on how that one relates to Ed Gein. In 1988, Thomas Harris wrote the novel The Silence of the Lambs. Following the novel came the movie in 1991, which is still a favorite in pop culture. I would be shocked if you have never seen it, but again, spoiler alert. Buffalo Bill is the murderer in this film. He wants to become a woman, but he can't undergo the surgery for gender reassignment due to his psychological issues. So instead, he murders overweight women and uses their skin to make a suit so he can feel transformed. He lured these women to his house where he kept them in a well in his basement. He let them starve so their skin would become saggy and loose, easier to peel off the body. He didn't feed them, but he did use a basket to lower down lotion where it rubs the lotion on its skin to remain supple. That is the number one scene that stands out in my mind from Silence of the Lambs. Well, other than Anthony Hopkins saying, "Hello, Clarice." Such a good movie. Ed Gein was not a typical serial killer. I don't believe he killed for pleasure or that he wanted the notoriety in the media like a lot of serial killers do. He longed for his mother, Augusta, his one true love. He would do anything to try and feel close to her again. and that happened to be surrounding himself and wearing the skin of dead women who mildly resembled her. I've wondered why he didn't use his actual mother's skin. My first thought was that the bodies needed to be fresh when he skinned them, so maybe he didn't get this idea until she was already decomposing. Or maybe he just couldn't cut into his mommy. Other women, no biggie. This story is beyond creepy, and I feel like it was perfect for October. There is one more episode before Halloween. I do have something in mind, but I'm not sure I'm going to top this one. The source information for today's episode can be found listed on the show notes. Be sure to subscribe to Killer Stories on your podcast app so you never miss a new episode. You can also listen at killerstories.buzzsprout.com. Follow me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast. My Twitter is at Killer Stories PC. Email for the story suggestions is killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Support the show and buy me a drink. Visit buymeacoffee.com/killerstories. Thanks for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.